Good day, everyone. Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com. Welcome to another DevOps.com webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by our friends at TaskTop, and I think it's going to be one of our best yet. It's actually a look back on 2017 DevOps Enterprise favorites, culled from the DevOps Enterprise Summit, run by Gene Kim and IT Revolution, or does as many of us call it. And we're going to get a really good look at both Gene and Dr. Kersten, co-founder and CEO of TaskTop. You know, what do they consider their favorites from this past year's DOES events? And maybe we'll even have a little news about upcoming DOES Europe in London in June. Before we get started, though, let me just quickly mention, for those new to our webinars, we have our GoToWebinar control panel, which for most of you is in the top right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a little question section there. Excuse me. And if you click the arrow to make it face downwards, it'll expand. And you can see you could ask questions in there. And this is really important for this webinar because, unfortunately, we're probably going to take up the full hour with Gene and Mick's presentation. However, they were kind enough to ask if we can get the questions in written format here. We will submit them to both the TaskTop and IT Revolution team, and we'll try to get you answers, right? We respect your time and appreciate everyone joining in with us. So don't be afraid, don't be shy, ask questions in real time. They'll be queued, and we'll do our best to get to them after. If we do have time, we'll do them right on air. But if not, we'll have a record of them. We'll do our best to get to them. With that being said, if you have any technical issues, perhaps the slides aren't rolling or what have you, you can, we do have engineers standing by. If you go to the chat section of your control panel and type in, if you're able to, type in your particular problem, we'll do our best to rectify that and get you running with a smooth webinar experience. So that should take care of that. Let me answer one other question that's always asked, and that is this being recorded? Will the slides be available? Yes and yes, this is being recorded. It will be available via DevOps.com and TaskTop, and the slide deck will be available, enhanced with updated links to many of the presentations that Mick and Gene are going to be talking about. So with that being said, let's move on. As I said, our panel today really needs no introduction. First of all, returning is Dr. Mick Kersten. Nick is the co-founder and CEO of TaskTop. Always a pleasure to have on our webinars, knowledgeable. Mick, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. Great to be here.
Thank you. And then secondly is my friend, actually the person who got me into DevOps many years ago, Gene Kim, author, researcher, founder of IT Revolution, an all-around DevOps kind of guy. Gene, welcome.
Hey, great to be here again, Alan. Happy New Year.
You too. Happy New Year to everyone out there. Guys, I already took up 3 minutes. We don't have 3 minutes to waste. Take it away. I'm sitting back and looking forward to this one.
Awesome. Yeah, the purpose of this webinar is actually to share some of our favorite talks from DevOps Enterprise. And so just a brief introduction on DevOps Enterprise. We're going to the fourth year, going into the fifth year now. And so it was really originally conceived as a conference for technology leaders who are transforming how technology work is done in large, complex organizations. So showing that DevOps is not just for the unicorns, but for the horses. So in the early years, there were no unicorns allowed. It was really just people from large, complex organizations that have been around for decades or even centuries. And the primary type of talks that are given there are experience reports. Very specifically, we had each person give a 30-minute presentation in this format. Tell me about the industry you compete in. Tell us about your organization. What was the business problem that you set out to solve? Where did you start and why? What did you do? What were the outcomes? What problems still remain? And over the years, we've built up over 200 and now probably 40 case studies of large, complex organizations transforming, including some of the largest brands and most recognized brands in almost every industry vertical. And Mick, you and I have had so many conversations about the journeys that these technology leaders are undergoing. And it's been just for me, it's just been such a privilege to help chronicle these journeys. Any thoughts on that, Mick?
Yes, Gene, I think for me, the really big thing, and for those of you who haven't attended the conference, for me, the first conference, the first one I attended was, it was, just a big phase shift, because I'd been attending almost every industry conference that I knew of in the agile, lean sort of space, around software delivery, every vendor conference with all the partners that stuff has. And it was walking to that room and again hearing that conversation shift from here's how everything worked beautifully in our internet scale business, if for this unicorn or that unicorn or this brand new startup with 30 staff, into how things actually work at scale in the enterprise, was so much more closely aligned to what our customers are dealing with, where the actual real interesting problems with DevOps, with scaling software delivery lie. So I always recommend this as the #1 show for basically everyone I talk to go to. And for me personally, it's the highest learning moment usually of the year, both San Francisco and London, both in terms of what we see on stage, and then Gene and I get to try to process that after, because we're continuing learning even after the show, even through these conversations, and of course the conversations that happen there. So I hope to see even more of you who are tuning into this attending the next one, because there's nothing like being immersed in all of this sharing and learning. So
awesome. And so we have put together our favorite, if we have time for it, the top 10 presentation we've chosen from DevOps Enterprise San Francisco. That was just 2 months ago. So Mick, I believe you are up first.
Yeah, and so for me, I think that there was so much great content. It's always hard to pick the favorite ones, but what I've done here, and I think what Gene's done here as well, is just pick some of the ones that shifted our thinking the most. And this is one from Barclays, from Jonathan Smart, who's the head of development there, who gave a general session that was just fascinating. So I'll try to highlight a few of the key points here, and really why it's a little bit different, why it caused me to think differently, and why I think it should cause some of those organizations who are doing something similar to what Barclays did to think a little bit differently. So for Barclays, this was a presentation that's about how you get these benefits that, again, you'll hear digital natives, you'll hear startups getting in the small, but how you do that at Barclays scale, how you do that at organizations that have been around for over 100 years. Jonathan Smart pointed out, I think, that Barclays has been around as long as basically as currency has been around.
That's why I created in the year 1690. Predating.
Yes, exactly.
Currency.
Yet at the same rate, we all know that these organizations have to go through these transformations, and they have to.
Sorry, one more data point. So they have about 30,000 engineers, broadly defined as dev, QA, operations, security. So just Barclays scale means tens of thousands of engineers.
Yeah, exactly. And this is I think where the points where we see things get very interesting with these modernizations efforts, these digital transformation efforts, whatever you call them, these DevOps transformation efforts, and how you actually get those benefits that you see, but with the control that you need in a regulated industry, in a safety critical industry, again, at these, but also at these kinds of scales. And so I think that the really big, shift that John Smart challenged the audience with is how you approach an agile transformation. And I think we hear this a lot. Sometimes we hear these called DevOps transformations. And his point was don't do an agile transformation. Barclays had been doing enough attempts at an agile transformation and having weird symptoms from that. He said that the organization actually needs to focus on the outcomes. And what are those outcomes? So those outcomes are flow and quality and happiness for the practitioners, for the IT staff, for the developers, the engineers, the operations staff, and value. So rather than going to an existing line of business and say, do you want us to do this agile transformation for you? John started going to the different business units and saying, do you want to have higher velocity flow? Do you want to have more quality? Do you want to have happier engineers and developers and staff? Do you want to deliver more value to the business? And those answers are obviously yes. Whereas so many, and I've encountered this over and over again, so many large-scale organizations, the 10, 20,000, 30,000 in the case of Barclays, IT staff organizations have had these fits and starts of transformations. And I think a lot of them have actually come from Agile, where Agile really was, a lot of the practices around Agile, the concepts and theories are amazing. I think we certainly practice them at TaskUp. I have since the Kent Beck XP book. But the way that you scale those was never sufficiently specified. I think what organizations are noticing is that what's happened with DevOps is that there's a kernel there that starts working. Once you start automating your continuous integration, your continuous delivery, look at your end-to-end delivery pipeline, something starts working. It becomes actually exercise how to scale that. But the reality is that a lot of organizations have been burned by some kind of failed agile transformation and not quite understood why. And the concepts of either just scaled agile framework either came too late or were too complex or something, even though there's some great concepts there. So I think the shift here is just focus on the outcomes, focus on end-to-end flow through your value stream, rather than, again, saying, okay, we're going to just do everything differently right now, and everyone's going to have, the entire business is going to have to learn what epics are. So the outcome-oriented view here is that you get faster flow through the value stream, you get higher quality, and you don't lose control. And I think one of the most fascinating things that John Smart presented that he did at Barclays is to actually create what he called a lean control tool. So the fact that Barclays does have very rigorous requirements, the risk requirements and security requirements and those kinds of things that often feel like they're fuzzier, they should be part of the pipeline and so on. He's actually integrated them right into the agile planning cycle, right into the visibility for the business, and right into the DevOps and delivery pipeline. So you can see that value. He's actually integrated the happiness. This one was near and dear to me. And we know that when you look at really large scale value streams with hundreds of teams, the actual productivity, the flow through those value streams has to do with how happy the people are doing the work. That's why organizations like TaskTop, that's why the good companies out there do things like measuring employee net promoter score, because we know that happier developers that don't have to do all this tedious or manual work, developers that actually get to see their code shipping on a daily basis or at least a weekly basis are actually much happier and feeling their impact than those that have to wait for 6 weeks to get a license and then another 2 months to get a saving. Yeah, Gino, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts there. So actually, these things are measurable, and you can have the speed and control if you take this end-to-end view and if you take this systems thinking view of connecting those parts in your business, like the controls, filling in the gaps. What's amazing is that Barclays actually created their lean control tool, and they had to connect that to their older school project management as well as their newer school agile systems, and then of course connected all of that to the delivery pipeline. That's what delivers the value. So I actually think this shift, especially for the leaders who are struggling with fits and starts of these agile transformations, this shift to results is a great one. Do you any other thoughts on this one?
Just a commentary. I was reflecting as you were talking. On the safety panel, we had a 4-hour film session, and we were actually talking about how the same thing happened in the lean community. Is that as you had like in the lean community, eventually you had to get to a product to sell, whether it was training or toolkits or whatever, and then there's something bad that happens potentially, right? Where it's more about the acquisition about the product around the product as it is about the outcomes, and that was even books are the same way, right? Is that somehow in the productization of these movements, we lose sight of the outcomes, and so the observation that you had about the agile transformation, which will probably very well happen with the DevOps community, right? I think kind of the way we proactively deal with that in the community is doing what John has done, right? It's not about the broad umbrella practices, really about the outcomes. I thought it was just brilliantly presented.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, Gene. I just do think that the DevOps community is standing on a stronger foundation, not to mess this up as just a proliferation of consulting services that say don't meet a large scale customer need, because it is based on a tool platform, automation, and results. So I actually think we're standing on some of the pitfalls that this is my view at least, some of the pitfalls that we saw with the agile community having trouble speaking to the scale of these large organizations. Again, I think that the DevOps community is actually standing on a stronger foundation here. So.
And I think we're very acutely aware of the cargo culting risk. So yeah, absolutely. Should we go on to the next? Okay, perfect. The next one is, and like Mick, I'll preface this by saying these are not in rank order. These are just the top 10s of the broad population. These are the 10 that we chose to present because it's so thought-provoking. Now, one of those would have to be John Rester, John, as we call him, John Rez, from KeyBank, now SVP and Director of Continuous Delivery. So he presented this year with Stephanie Gillespie, SVP of Head of Digital Channel Technology. Sorry about the typo. And so maybe on the next slide, here's some of the context of what makes this so interesting to me. So John Rez attended DevOps Enterprise in 2015, and he left saying, this is something that we must do at Key. And then he submitted a talk, and we accepted in 2016, and it was just astounding. The 2016 gist of the presentation was that there was this customer impacting outage where basically all the consumer banking properties went down for a day. And he essentially responded to that by proposing that there must be there was an urgent need to modernize the technology platform that Key was residing upon, and one of the and so he came back in 2016 to actually present that story. And one of the things I just loved about it was he put together this amazing diagram just showing whenever a consumer had to log in to the bank, there's something like 230 network connections that had to be made, often ping-ponging between data centers, and just showing how what was actually built originally for redundancy has actually magnified the risk of outages. And incidentally, the way that this amazing animated slide was created was through a C# program that he wrote that they called a resonator. So just I think another mark of these technology leaders is that they are they're close to technology as well as being very business savvy. So what was interesting is that in 2016 he presented about how they moved the entire consumer online banking properties into Docker containers, running it in Kubernetes on OpenShift, and radically transforming how the deployment model, the automation model at KeyBank. This last year we asked him to present with his partner in crime, Stephanie Gillespie. And so the story that he told was how that they worked together essentially to the way they sold this project was to advance this as a way to achieve what they called the Digital 17 initiative. So in other words, this was the digital disruption, the need to reduce the cost and time to experiment, make it more safe. That was being driven by Beth Moody, the CEO of KeyBank. And so part of this audacious proposal was actually to do this initially in 16 months. They took it down to less than 12 months. And the reason they did this was that they wanted to, they had just acquired first Niagara. It was the largest acquisition in the company history. And what they wanted to avoid was having to onboard and transition all their customers once and then have to do it again to get them into the Digital 17 platform. And so they actually shrunk the timeline from 16 months down to less than a year. And so this is I just love it because what sounds very injudicious in terms of reducing the timeline was actually something that was, I think, incredibly savvy and creating incredible business value. So the other thing that I thought was remarkable and so memorable for me about this presentation was that this project actually was being talked about on CNBC Mad Money with Jim Cramer. My friend John Willis, he's a co-author on the DevOps Handbook. He said, we know DevOps will have made it when it's actually on CNBC Mad Money. He said that in 2010, and that actually happened in 2017. This was actually on the Red Hat earnings call, where KeyBank was being mentioned with containers and Docker, in the context of helping deliver business value for KeyBank, and just to see this level of support from the CEO of the company was just something that is absolutely remarkable. And I think will make 2017 was one of the hallmark events for me for 2017. Mick, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that for me, you touched on the most memorable part of that talk, which is there's just some amazing content in it. But when he showed that diagram of, again, the trace of network connections made on a fairly sophisticated network for I think it was one customer transaction, it was just mind blowing, and just it made me. And again, the fact that he was able to generate this, how he did it, like, writing this code himself, but it was just making me imagine if only we could have that kind of sort of visibility, that way of spotting a bottleneck, or the way that we flood our teams with requests for a delivery value stream, for what happened when we addressed an incident across teams and the way they scrambled. That's exactly what I was thinking of. The same kind of visibility that we can have for our service architectures, our backend systems. If we could have them for a delivery pipeline, wouldn't that be amazing? So I thought that was just super cool.
And yeah, it's funny because what was so remarkable about that in the network transactions, and equally true for the flow of work in a software delivery value stream, is that no silo sees the problem, right? There's like they see the tickets come in and out, they get closed, no problem. But when you zoom out far enough, it becomes evident that something terrible is actually happening. That's introducing tremendous risks to the business.
That was exactly it. Is that if you imagine yourself as being the admin for one of those servers or one of those parts of the app portfolio, you would not see the problem. It's exactly the same. No problem, but you see that there's no way we can scale transaction processing if this is what it looks like.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, let's go to the next one. That was KeyBank.
All right, so John Allspaw. So this may have been one of the most technically profound and sophisticated talks I heard, and it was just mind-blowing, and I'm going to just touch on a part of it. And by the way, I did want to mention that each one of these talks is recorded on YouTube, so just go on YouTube, search for the name and DevOps San Francisco, and it'll pop right up. We'll also have the links and the downloadable slides as well. But Gene, could you just, the way that you introduced John and the way that he then introduced himself, if you could just recap that, because I think it'll signal just how.
Yeah, so I think many people will recognize John's contributions. I mean, it is probably really impossible to overstate how significant his contributions are. He was responsible for really kicking off the DevOps movement in many people's view in his famous 2009 presentation that he did of 10 deploys every day at Flickr with his dev counterpart Paul Hammond. He was one of the chairs of the Velocity conference for nearly a decade. He then became the CTO at Etsy, where he helped build a world-class technology organization that went public 2 years ago, and now he is created a company called Adaptive Capacity Labs, where he's working with some of the most largest luminaries in the safety culture space. He invented the postmortem practice. He has really adapted all the safety culture learnings to the DevOps world that we live in.
And he presented it towards the start of this talk. He presented just this fascinating view, sort of zoomed in out of it. We're not going to do it justice right now. I certainly won't. You should, if you're interested by anything that we say here, you should watch this talk, because John's got such a profound understanding of how these large-scale and complicated and complex, and I'm sure for some it's chaotic systems work. And he presented this view where we have to look at the systems below the line, and that's where the actual transactions and operations and applications are actually working. This is the real software working. This is the level of the processors and the networks. And he pointed out that we never, in these large systems, we never really understand the systems below the line. And I think, Gene, the KeyBank example is similar, right? That was one transaction that could have been just seconds, those 230 network connections that were made. And of course, all of these systems are scaling. So we sort of have to accept that we work on these systems below the line, but as they're executing, as they're becoming more complex, as the data sets that they're processing change their behavior even more, what's happening below the line is the complexity is just growing. But then above the line is actually our representation of the system. So for a developer, you might be thinking of your type hierarchy. For someone on the operations side, you might be thinking about your microservice architecture and so on. And this is where we frame our understanding of the system. And those things don't always match. People have different views of it. People have contributed different parts of it. And the complexities now, beyond what a single person or a single team or even a set of teams can handle. So if you accept that for a moment, this is, I think, that when the most accessible, probably, lessons learned from the talk that we can all apply right now, but I think it's a really, really profound point. So if we think now of what should drive software design, what should drive architecture, I'm going to just move back for a second. A lot of the architectural practices that we've had have been around creating these kinds of layerings and architectures below the line that will scale and will provide us a good separation of concerns between the model and the views and the presentation layers and so on. But things are just getting much more complex than that. And so John said, well, what if we look at what acts on the stuff below the line? And again, with his experiences with internet scale, with Etsy, what really should be shaping the design of new components, the design of subsystems, is this flow of incidents. And this quote was just mind-blowingly brilliant to me when I heard that incidents of yesterday inform the architecture of tomorrow. So what we really should be architecting is a system that's going to more gracefully support whatever that set of incidents is tomorrow. And rather than architecting for this, for perfect layering or perfect modularity, whatever our preconceptions are from our past work as software architects or operations architects, we really should be optimizing our value streams for supporting that next flow of incidents. And for me, this really hit home, because a lot of what I've been thinking about is in terms of organizations that are shifting, and this is what's happening with all of our customers, from a project-oriented mentality and this contractor control model to a product-oriented mentality, which is key to a digital transformation, where you're really looking at bringing products and features of those products to market faster and measuring the revenue results rather than measuring whether your project completed on time and on budget. You really want to optimize your entire software architecture and your entire end-to-end value stream architecture for the flow of features. The more features you can bring to market, the more competitive you'll be, the more delighted your users will be, and hopefully the better your revenue results and success. And John presented his stories here on how you actually need to also optimize that same value stream, that same stuff below the line, even your understanding above the line, which is why the blameless postmortems are so key. Because the difficult incidents are really complex. You might need 40 people in a room to understand what got you there. But really, this got me thinking about our architectures need to be optimized for that future flow of incidents. And I think he had this other great quote in there, which was that incidents are unplanned investments. And again, I thought this is exactly how we should. This is the way that we should be thinking about our end-to-end system architectures. Gene, any more thoughts on this?
Yeah, two things. In fact, one is just there's so just a little more specificity around above the line, below the line. So below the line is everything that our systems run on. So that's the code repos, that's the ticketing systems, that's the artifact repository, that's our it's everything behind the screens. It's our monitoring tools. It's it's basically everything. It's the environments, the containers, and what's above the line is everything in front of the screen. So that's our people. It's our meetings. It's basically where the cognition happens. Is where we're trying to create the mental models. And I was in this. I'm doing this project with John Willis called the Beyond the Phoenix Project, and we had an hour just discussing this. And one of the profound epiphanies for me that really helped me understand how critical John Allspaw's observation is the MIT beer game. There's this famous game that was created at MIT where it essentially had like 10 turns. You had 3 players. One was a beer manufacturer, a beer distributor, and one was a retailer. And there's only one action you take, which is an order from your upstream supplier. Essentially what they found was that in 95% of trials, everybody's out of business by long before the 10th turn, because the feedback loops are so slow, and the link between cause and effect are just so obscured because of the latency. It takes a couple turns for orders to actually get fulfilled. So here is a very simple system: 3 nodes, and 10 turns, and if that system has these kind of complex characteristics where it is very difficult to control. Think of something that is running on tens of thousands of systems, running across millions of lines of code. If we can't even, if the MIT beer game is below the line, even knowing the rules does not help us, achieve good results. So I think for me this was just it just showed how utterly complex the systems we rely upon are, and all we have are things above the line. Does that make sense, Mick? I mean, I thought you would get a kick out of that in terms of.
No, I think, exactly. I think the fact that you're making it just more concrete, what's above the line, what's below the line, I think is key. And yeah, just the sheer complexity that I'm sure people listening to this webinar have within their systems below the line, and the way that we struggle to represent that above the line. And again, the fact that I actually think the points that he made about focusing on incidents and what effect that incident has. What does that mean about your architecture? What does it mean about where you're brittle? What does it mean about what actions you need to take in terms of evolving your architecture, your value stream, your team structures, your talent, your training, whatever it is, in order to make sure that that next incident doesn't do that same thing, that you've got more safety around around that part of the system. They're complex enough right now that thinking about it actually in terms of what's going to happen to them, rather than architecting them ahead of time for every possible scenario for these complex systems is going to be the better approach. So,
Mick, by the way, for people who are listening, Mick is one of my favorite people to talk to as we sort of synthesize these big ideas. There's two things that I loved about the MIT beer game studies. One is CEOs of Fortune 50 companies perform no better than high school students. In other words, supply chain knowledge, and business knowledge does not actually help performance. Secondly, in almost every trial, when they interview people, as everyone's gone out of business, people react with anger. They're like, someone that I'm playing with does not understand the rules. They cannot understand that this is the only way to rationalize the poor results. And I think this just shows how important fast feedback is and how critical having an accurate mental model is. And so if it's that hard for the MIT beer game, right, how much harder is it for a genuinely complex system with millions of nodes? So love that you chose this one, Nick.
Yeah, I just want to throw one more thing at that, because I think John has a very good sense for the cultural aspects of this as well. We've talked about mostly the technology, but above and below the line. But these problems are complex enough. We have our own biases in terms of how we see things above the line, and just the way that John Allspaw has taught the industry around putting in place blameless postmortems so that you actually get to the root causes and a shared understanding, because you'll need a shared one. It's too complex for one person to understand now, of what's happening below the line, what that incident caused, I think is key. So another, I think, key practice, key takeaway from this is dig into what John's done on postmortems. Look at putting in place these blameless postmortems for your organization, because it's just too complex at this stage to not do that.
Awesome. Let's see here. The next one is okay. So this was there was a panel that I ran on the third day that was probably one of the most rewarding professional experiences of my life. Before that, we actually did a 4-hour film session of these three gentlemen. So one is Dr. Sidney Dekker, who tremendously influenced the work of John Allspaw. So he wrote many books, including a book called Just Culture, Drift into Failure. He's a professor at Queensland University, at University of Brisbane. He is credited for really help create the first making the work of Dr. David Woods at Ohio State University understandable. And this was actually what got John Allspaw into safety culture. The second person is Dr. Stephen Spear. I consider him to be a mentor of mine. He wrote, he's an adjunct lecturer at MIT. He did his PhD on the Toyota production system. He actually, as part of his PhD dissertation, worked on the plant floor of a Tier 1 Toyota supplier for 6 months. And he wrote a book called The High Velocity Edge. And Mick, one of my favorite parts of the book is actually the foreword that was written by Clay Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma. And part of it, he said, is that Dr. Spear's work may be the most significant work to come out of the Harvard Business School. That's probably the most amazing forewords ever written. And the third one is Dr. Richard Cook. He wrote a chapter in the web operations book that John Allspaw had put together in 2010. And he wrote a chapter called Why Complex Systems Fail, and essentially bridging the world of safety culture directly into the DevOps domain and around internet operations. And he's not a PhD, he's actually a practicing physician. He's an anesthesiologist. And so the goal of this panel, the panel was essentially the summarized output of the 4 hours we had in the morning to explore the commonalities between lean and safety culture, and explore places of genuine divergence. And I listened to this panel 5 times. I just thought every sentence was so meaningful, and I felt like I was getting smarter every time I listened to it. So on the next slide, I summarized some of my learnings. So I think there is this. I think this more than anything cemented for me this conviction that DevOps is drawing upon these 2 schools of thought the most in terms of lean. I mean, that's where we get so much of our language around flow and value streams and so forth, and safety culture in terms of, and sometimes safety culture is known as resilience engineering or human factors. If you take a look at the Hawaii civil defense missile alert, right? I mean, that was a human factors issue, right? The fact that there was 7 menu items that all looked the same, right? And one of them was rehearse, one was a real missile alert. Someone clicked on the wrong button. Yeah, that's not a human error. That's a profound design error. There's a point that was made so brilliantly by all 3 panelists about the need for not just psychological safety, right? It's just as Dr. Decker said, it's very easy to say make it safe for everyone to talk, but the more challenging part is usually the symmetry needed by the leader, right? That, as Dr. Spears said, it takes a stunning amount of humility to be able to say I don't know, or to say I was wrong. As he said, you can't talk about psychological safety and then have the leader act like a pompous jackass, right? So it takes some often profound changes in cultural norms and what even the behaviors we want to model as leaders. There was a great discussion about the investigation into the high-profile accidents in the South Pacific in the U.S. Navy. I think there's been 3 or 4 collisions between U.S. warships and civilian ships, resulting in loss of life, horrendous loss of both in casualties and property damage, etc. And there was a phrase that Dr. Spears said about is like how we talk about near misses, right? We know that we have to talk about not just the accidents, but all the times when we didn't have an accident, specifically the near misses. And do we talk about it? We can talk about it in one of 2 ways. One is, through the lens of heroism. In other words, yes, we were in danger, but thanks to bravery and good decisions, we avoided the accident. Or is the narrative, we were not in control. As Dr. Spears said, there by the grace of God go I. We were this close to having an accident, and it was due to luck. But here's what we did, and so the first, there's nothing to learn from. The second actually does help inform. Like when we are in situations where we have lost or are nearing the loss of control, what can we do to help prevent a catastrophic outcome? So I thought that was just an incredible way to frame, I think, what we need out of these bodies of knowledge. And the third that was very memorable to me is came from Dr. Cook in terms of like the ethics of DevOps. In the airline industry, pilots do not consider themselves, they consider themselves first and foremost pilots, regardless of who their employer is. And they just happen to be working at a specific airline at the time. And I love this notion, and I think maybe one of the new aspirations for this year is what can we do to help inform what the ethics of DevOps are. Are we a community of practice that really transcend the organization that happens to employ us? So those are, sorry for rambling on, but this is something I just found very meaningful and impactful. Mick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this was all news to me. So I had never dug into safety culture. I was just curious and wondering why you introduced it to the community basically at this conference, Gene, and it was eye-opening to me. Both in terms of the presentations, I had a chance to chat with Dr. Cook and so on, and others. And for me, I think it just shows where we're headed, and just the fact that the criticality to the business of the decisions that are being made or the mistakes that are being made, right? We've got these very large software platforms. We've got all organizations are trying to bring more, all enterprise IT organizations trying to bring more to market. The safety criticality, the security footprints are growing. And if we don't start learning from these, these lessons from the from this other chunk of the industry, other chunk of the economy, we're not going to have the right kind of culture. We're not going to have the right kind of decision-making, problem-solving, or as you said, narrative to identify these problems, right? There's someone in your organization. You might have a massive security hole in your organization. Your business might be on the brink of collapse because of how big that footprint is. If someone gets into it, you might have that Equifax scenario happening, and someone will know that. But if the narrative is of blame, or if the narrative is not of this kind of constructive problem solving, those things might not come out. And it's just, I mean, for me, I'm still just processing all of this, right? Because I've done some, I had some, did some work at university, some courses on human factors, but the connection between human factors, just the safety criticality of the systems, some of which run our financial industry, some of which run hospitals, or missile systems. All of this is, I think, on the precipice of us needing to very, very quickly learn about what's worked in terms of safety culture and how we apply that. Because I think that the biggest thing for me there is really how it applies to the way that we manage software delivery and the kind of culture we need these examples that John Allspaw's got, like of the blameless postmortems, that I think a lot of organizations out there going through the digital transformations have to shift into very, very quickly. So I think this is one I'm personally going to dig into and look forward to chatting with you, Morgene, because there's something very significant happening here that I feel I need to catch up on. So
that's to summarize what I learned in the Beyond the Phoenix project, which is coming out in March. Is essentially Decker was actually really came up with safety 1 and safety 2. Safety 1, the safety 1 response to the Hawaii missile accident would be, this is a operator error. We need more training. We need more compliance checks, right? We gotta increase the number of controls, right, and maybe authorization controls, right, to reduce the bad outcome from happening. Safety 2 is saying, it's not the human that's the problem; it's the system that's the problem, and so clearly, the famous stories of B-17 landing gear thing is that they found that often pilots, after they had landed the B-17, they would raise the flaps and then accidentally raise the landing gear, which would cause the plane to plop on the ground, destroy the propellers, and so forth. And so they found no matter how much training, how much they would weed out the pilots who are underperforming, the accidents kept on happening, and until some engineer discovered that the flap switch and the landing gear switch were right next to each other, and they were the same size and shape. And
wow.
So the countermeasure was on the flaps. They put like a curved piece of metal, it's like the shape of the flaps. And on the landing gear control, they put a wheel on it, so that there would be some tactile feedback, and the accident rate went to 0. So, the modern treatment of this is interaction design, UX, and so forth. So, it was the first time I understood why they call it human factors as opposed to, resilience engineering or safety culture. All right, back to you, Mick.
Yeah, and I think as we go into the next talk, I think there's for me at the conference there was this common theme as well, right? Is we've got, so there's the Deming quote of a bad system will beat a good person every time, and the degree to which these are complex systems are, the end-to-end delivery pipeline, which includes, I just always imagine that as the network of every single person, every single team, and how they're interconnected, and just basically the way that these systems get in the way of people doing work today, and either encourage mistakes or hide problems or so on, is just something we have to get past. And I think Chris Hill has got a great mind for this. So he's at Jaguar Land Rover, and he's been trying to put this kind of new connectivity, this new way of connecting sort of the end-to-end systems of software delivery to place at JLR. So and I think we've seen a lot of this. I'm not going to rehash this into how you have to break through silos and connect the different backlogs and teams and systems. He did something that I just had not, I feel like I should have understood it before, but I didn't quite understand it till he was taking me through, till I saw his presentation. And so he drew, and we've all seen this different sort of value stream diagrams, or whether we look at them as tool chains or how teams are connected or layered and so on. And he drew this diagram of an organization that he'd been familiar with. And of course, everything works when it's a small set of teams. But he showed us various diagrams through his presentation. I really encourage you to watch it, because he actually drew these lines of empathy. So for example, kind of a product owner who maybe has been a developer or technical can probably empathize with a developer. But they might have to, or a hardware designer. But the customer, for example, might not empathize with that designer. And so the way that those people are connected is actually, they're basically speaking different languages, right? One might be very focused on these human factors, one might be focused just purely on architecture. And so he took us through this walk through an organization and looked at actually the lines of empathy of how people understand what they're doing. And he, and I'll just quickly jump into the summary of his lessons learned, but basically saying as people need to switch tasks and context between these different capabilities, sometimes jumping into a whole new environment, usually jumping into a whole new tool, things just get lost, information gets lost, we don't learn. Empathy, he's actually looking at how we can connect these teams, and obviously the Spotify team, cross-functional teams, help actually bridge some of those lines of empathy, help people understand each other. And again, a way to look at this is how you, both from a collaboration perspective and from just a team building and culture perspective, connect those above the line models, whether it's to problem solve around an incident or just to get work done, just to break out an interesting feature into the work that needs to be done to get it delivered. And then he did have this interesting view as well, is that using basically connecting the tool set, connecting the way that work is being done, connecting the communication, actually reduces the penalty of those switches and then brings the people closer together, rather than having this problem we've had of just throwing things over the fence, right? The architects throwing the architecture over the fence and some specification, the product owners throwing wireframes over the fence, and identifying how big a failure pattern this is and then impediment to flow this is. So I think this was kind of fascinating to me, but looking at it not just as the way we've been talking about for a long time, but actually looking at connecting those people and then those lines of empathy, and then again those shared above the line models in the end. So
what I find so interesting about Chris Hill's presentations is just the complexity of the software supply chain, across how many different engineering firms are working, and the suppliers and so forth. So yeah, the enormity of the problems that he is solving are just breathtaking. We have 13 minutes left. So how about we just keep? We'll stick to your faster pace. My next one is Capital One. So Topo Pal has presented at DevOps Enterprise for 4 years in a row, and is one of the most interesting people in the DevOps Enterprise community. This year, he chose to present with Jennifer Brady. She is Director of Technology Governance at Capital One. And so what I love about this presentation is on the next slide. So one is, it has been one of the many-year mission for Topo to show that that we can be even more secure using continuous delivery than we can with status quo, or as he would assert, even far more secure. And what made this presentation so interesting was that you presented with Jennifer Brady, who used to be the Director of Internal Audit of IT Audit at Capital One. And so she comes from a community of auditors. We were both, I was a due-paying member at the Institute of Internal Auditors for nearly a decade. And the fact that she has partnered with Topo to show that to make DevOps defensible, not only to internal security and compliance teams, but legal, external assessors, auditors, and regulators, was just incredible. Just showing how that, here's Topo working with someone with a deep domain expertise in audit and compliance, in control environments, was just incredible. And one of the highlights for me was how the rigor of why Topo rejected the notion of, we'll just have in order to get the separation of duty concerns met, we'll just have someone else push the button. And he just logically attacked this, saying that there's no outcome of this that is actually good for Capital One. Right? The instant they become, even if you pick someone who doesn't have any skills to push the button, the instant they do become more skillful, they won't want to push the button anymore. They want to become a developer. I mean, it's just the integrity of which he thought through the control environment was just breathtaking. So Capital One was, that's why that was among my favorites.
Yeah, and I think I really enjoyed Topo's point as well, Gene. And I think the big thing is, I don't know, it just seems, and this was a bit of a theme in some of the talks, definitely some of the ones that resonated with me, is that I think there's been too much within the organizations I speak to, the customers I speak to, of this either or, right? That we're going to go, okay, let's do this greenfields, get some new tool chain, and do this greenfields development, and then later figure out how to work it within our controls, work it into our large-scale delivery process as we learn. And the organizations are succeeding with scaling more quickly rather than just this endless experimenting. That's really, in this bimodal type way that I think is very self-limiting. They're actually thinking about this up front, and it's even back to John Smart's talk, which is that you can have speed and control. You should architect your value streams with controls into it, and then I think Topo had some very interesting insights in terms of how you do that, and then this button push and roll not being an effective way of doing it. But I think that the thing that I've seen work, and this goes right back to open source projects, where it's not an either or of having traceability of your controls. You just build that in to your tool automation and value stream, and then you basically get both. I remember it was actually Tom Grant who told me way back that he did while he was at Forrester, he did an analysis of agile highly regulated industries, very traditional horses, and he found better throughput, because they had actually properly architected for their flow to make sure the controls didn't impede their flow, and that caused them to actually have a more mature agile deployment rather than a very ad hoc one. So I think this is the approach to take to build this right in. So,
awesome.
9 minutes. Let's accelerate. Dominica DeGrandis. I think so. Dominica's got I read her book in the fall, and I think the Making Work Visible on IT Revolution Press. It's an amazing book. She took us through some of the ideas there that I want to highlight. She actually took us through a very personal perspective on internet presentation, because it's how we manage our own time, how we manage our own WIP. Whereas a lot of her work that I really encourage people to read is how to make work visible across the organization. But it's really interesting the way that her concepts actually scale from sort of personal time management to the team and then to the organization. So I think the amazing thing is that Dominica, I think there are a few sort of key concepts that I think that came out in this talk and that come out in her work, which is that we really need to look at end-to-end flow and to focus on flow time. Other things are important. So we've got cycle times important in terms of how quickly we're able to, development teams are able to get through user, from start to end on a user story. But really, Dominica's focusing on end-to-end flow time, which some call lead time. But she's had, I think, enough frustration with that debate. She's actually put this idea out there. We should look at flow time from when work starts to when it's done, not code complete to deploy, but completely end-to-end. And she's got these exercises for organizations, for teams to do in the book, where you really start analyzing your flow time, because that is how you get to finding your bottlenecks, to understanding whether your bottleneck is more upstream, to understanding whether you're actually waiting on acceptance criteria to be specified, or you just don't have enough designers, because most enterprise IT organizations have 1/10 of the UX designers, and even the human factors considerations that result from that, then some of the digital native companies and the new startups. So Dominica here has got some really nice models and sort of workshop exercises you can try on your own, or you can reach out to her on, in terms of how you start looking at whatever you're interested in, either your own personal, your teams, or your organization's end-to-end flow time. And we've been really building on that in terms of just populating this information, obviously, with the whole value stream network. Because the interesting thing is that all of this information for end-to-end flow time, from basically when a customer request came in, when an incident came in, to when you deployed that fix, when a feature request came in or something on your business strategy came in, to when you deployed that, and look at flow efficiency and bottlenecks. All of this is possible to do right now when you sort of formalize your tool chain and your value stream network. So she got that point across as well. Gene, anything to add there?
She's one of the best thinkers and doers in the space, and Yeah, and her book is fabulous.
Prime now.
Prime now. Okay, let's do this in 90 seconds. Tristan Matthew was the director of engineering at Amazon, and what I love about the story is that the making of Amazon Prime Now has never really been told. And what I think is so instructive about this case study is that everyone thinks doing things at Amazon is easy, but imagine having to deliver this capability where you click an order and it shows up on your door with between 15 minutes and 3 hours, and this breaks every component that you have to work with. Shopping cart, order fulfillment. Basically, you now have to touch over 300 different teams. And so Amazon is very decentralized. Imagine having to be reliant upon 300 teams that actually don't care about what your initiative is. that essentially the only lever you have is saying that Jeff Bezos needs this. And it's now up to this engineering director to make it happen. And he tells a story about how this was built, and that to create Amazon Prime Now required cutting across the 3 primary functions of Amazon: ordering, fulfillment, and transportation. This was originally thought to be just primarily a transportation problem, but involved profound changes to almost every business process at Amazon. What I love about it is the story is that it just explains why the Amazon Prime Now app is different from the Amazon app, right? So much was different that it was just easier to create a new app. I think it also informs why we need something like Scaled Agile in organizations that, as you said, how to do this outside of a team is not well specified. And I think the Tristan Matthew one shows kind of what is required to make this happen. And there was certainly an architectural discussion about what do you do when you're reliant upon 300 services and you have to wait an indefinite amount of time. How do you engineer your work so that you can actually model against something that despite the fact that you don't have what you need from those teams. I love this presentation.
All right, and my 90 seconds now is Troy McGennis. He had this. I just never had this view on things. I think what we're seeing is a bit more formalization and a bit more dovetailing of some of the, as you just touched on, Gene, the scaling agile concepts with the value stream. And so with Troy McGennis, who's got some tremendous experience at just some amazing scaling delivery at some organizations like Skype, for example, he took us through a more formal view of some of what some of us think of as this fuzzy front end, but just the sheer amount of work and the sheer amount of that goes into prioritization, into specifying these requirements, and the kinds of ways of doing that in terms of getting an optimal decision for what work will be done. So he's come up with, I'm just gonna flip through this really quickly, but he just has, if this is something that's of interest to you in terms of whether you adopt safe out of the box and using, in terms of how you prioritize work and what work you do, or whether you use the, in his terms here, the HIPPO, the highest person, as the prioritization, these things can be extremely consequential in terms of what work gets done. And he's got this very nice framework. There's a link in the slide deck that's downloadable. But in terms of what kinds of decisions and how we make those decisions and how we formalize that kind of work. So, for example, we can have in the top left here low to medium impact of being wrong, of whether we need to do this feature, this security fix over that. Whether we can have high impact. And I think this was what was so interesting again about the safety, culture, and human factors aspects that came out in this DevOps Enterprise Summit that was very new to me and interesting to me, is that business leaders routinely make decisions on what work should be prioritized that actually have this tremendously high impact of being wrong, where choosing can be fatal. It can cause a life, it can cause your business to falter, it can cause you to get Equifaxed. So we actually need to work in terms of the types of work that we prioritize. Not only do we need this safety and culture that embraces vulnerability and being wrong in terms of making sure that those things surface to the business, we need to give the business a language to make those trade-offs between racing to market on this new product or this new set of features versus doing this security fix or this hardening or these architecture changes, authentication changes first. And Troy's actually got, I think, a very mature, to me, a very appealing framework for how you could frame the types of work that are being done in the pipeline by engineering into business decisions. And I think we're starting to see that because, again, these things are so consequential. We actually need to, I think, formalize that business language with the work that's being done in the delivery pipeline. Gene?
Man, what a great segue, because certainly one of the most impactful presentations was the presentation that you did with Carmen Diardo at Nationwide. And this is almost the orthogonal axis. I think what's so interesting about the things that you're putting together in the volume stream architecture shows a way for us to express the conditions that we've all seen before. In other words, it's, in the presentation, you talk about the flow metrics, about how it informs engineering and business decisions, all in the quest for faster flow. And I love what's an aha moment for me over the many months that we've been talking about this is that it just explains, you can now express what are the conditions that causes technical debt to cause throughput to grind to the halt and actually lead to dangerous outages like LinkedIn 2009, or being able to create having an architecture where you can actually make urgent changes. For example, maybe in a different world, we could have actually quickly patched the Equifax systems that led, and the inability to do that led to the big breach. And it actually shows this virtual cycle we can get to if we can keep maximizing developer productivity and increasing flow, explaining the conditions that led to the birth of the automated testing culture at Google. So I think this is very complementary to Troy McGennis' talk about a decision-making framework and what should inform great architecture. So definitely phenomenal, exciting ideas coming out of the conference.
Yeah, I think this is, as Gene, as you can imagine, this is what excites me the most, is taking these architectural principles, these developer productivity principles, these automation principles into this end-to-end, what we're understanding is now of this value stream network, how we formalize that, how we learn from it, and so that's something we'll talk about in the future. But let's wrap up. Gene, let us know where we should all be flying to next.
Hey, DevOps Enterprise London is coming. This is the third year of the London conference on June 25th and 26th. The announcement just went out last night that blind bird pricing is open, so that's discounted because there's no scheduling details or some speaker details. But I can promise you it's going to be the best conference in London yet. And we just opened up the call for presentations. And specifically, we're looking for exciting ideas happening in operations. What does next generation operations look like, especially around immutability, functional programming, composition, composability, and so forth. And so stay tuned for a more expansive description of a track just dedicated to next generation operations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and Alan. Thank you.
Gene, I'm here. Gene, Mick, great. That was a great recap of some of the, I would say highlights, but they were all highlights. So that was a recap of 10 of the great presentations it does, but there's a lot more. I encourage people to check out the IT Revolution YouTube channel to get more. They've all been videoed and you can watch them there. You can also catch interviews of many of the speakers on our DevOps TV channel, including several with Mick. Gene, DevOps Enterprise Summit London is at O2 this year, which is, I think, like one of the largest auditoriums in Europe. Really should be a fantastic event if people listening can make it. To our friends at TaskTop, thank you so much for sponsoring today. Mick, as usual, a great job. I think we have a few more webinars coming up with you. We're looking forward to them. But we're going to call a wrap on this one. It's after the hour. Respect everyone's time. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.